Well, I want to welcome everyone to Tech Talk 3, Hybrid Church Leadership. I'm Barbara Stiers. I'm a member of the BCM leadership team. And this is week 3 of BCM's first virtual leadership focus conference. Over 150 Moravians from at least 62 different churches and agencies have registered for this conference. And so far, over 325 devices have logged on to one of the 9 sessions that we've had so far. It's not too late to tell friends and colleagues about this conference. You could tell them to register by going to moravianbcm.org. The conference continues through March 13th. And we're especially glad that this year's conference is an interprovincial event. It's co-sponsored by Moravian BCM of the Southern Province and the Healthier Congregations Task Force of the Northern Province. So right now you are all muted, but later in the session you will have an opportunity to share. If you've got comments or questions during the presentation, you can type them in the chat box below. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter this afternoon, Ryan Panzer. We've already learned a lot from Ryan in the previous 3 workshops he led. I'm sure we'll also benefit from his wisdom regarding hybrid church leadership, today's topic. Ryan is the author of Grace and Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. Ryan has spent his career in the worlds of church leadership and technology. He's received his MA from Luther Seminary while simultaneously working for Google. And he continues to serve as a learning and leadership development professional in the technology industry, as a researcher in digital technology in the church, and he's a lay leader at Good Shepherd Lutheran in Madison, Wisconsin. Ryan is a student of digital media and its influence on our lives, and he is focused on coaching Christian leaders to imagine the church's hybrid future, which will seamlessly blend offline and online experiences of worship, service, and spiritual practice. Ryan lives in Madison, Wisconsin with his wife, Annie, and their 1-year-old daughter, Alice. When Ryan isn't researching, writing, or playing with his toddler, he enjoys attending every Wisconsin Badger football game. Thank you, Ryan, for leading us today, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Barbara, and great to see so many familiar faces with us this afternoon. This is the 4th and final session that we'll have together, and today we'll be focused on hybrid church leadership, taking a focus on using collaborative technologies to broaden your invitational reach in the digital age. I want to start this afternoon by telling you about an experience I had with church leadership some 8 years ago when I was still working for Google in its Ann Arbor, Michigan office. It was a day not unlike today, and after work I had a meeting at the congregation. So I left my office in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. I left my parking spot. It took me about 5 minutes to get my car down the parking ramp. And like a lot of cities in college towns, traffic was a little heavy at 4 o'clock. So even though the church was only 1.5 miles from me, it took me about 20 minutes to get to the church. Now, like a lot of churches in college towns and in cities across America, there's no parking lot on site. So I tried to circle the block that afternoon, searching for a parking spot, but there was none to be found. After finally opting to just give up and pay for a parking spot in a ramp that was only halfway between my office and the congregation, I arrived for my meeting in an attempt to rebuild the church website with a committee exactly with 10 minutes to go before the meeting ended. That's the situation we're trying to avoid when we talk about church leadership in a digital age, and when we talk about church leadership in hybrid ministry. How can we take the best that collaborative technology has to offer in order to extend the farthest collaborative reach into our community? The idea here is to get as many great ideas and great perspectives into the work of the church as possible without letting barriers like traffic, parking, even schedule availability get in the way. Now, this is session number 4 of our time together. We started with a keynote where we talked about some of the trends with hybrid ministry. And through each of these latest sessions, we've been taking a deep dive into the areas of worship, faith formation, and church leadership. Each of those sessions is recorded, and you should have access to those sessions as an attendee of this conference. I've also shared a PowerPoint file for each of those sessions, which you can gladly make use of and share with any of your contacts. I also want to highlight that this is not the end of the conference, as Barbara mentioned. Make sure to tune in for Ben Ingebrigtsen's session, because what I've talked about on these sessions involves quite a bit of change. Ben is a master of leading churches through organizational change and times of transformation, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot from the wisdom that he has to share with all of you. As we've been going through these sessions, we've been talking about how church in a digital age, and specifically a hybrid model of church, is about moving the perceptions of Christian ministries from the columns on the left of this slide to the column on the right of this slide. We've been discussing how to move from a church that is fundamentally focused on proclamation to a church that curates questions, from a church that is viewed as being hierarchical to a church that's viewed as being collaborative. That'll be a main focus of our time this afternoon. We've talked about moving from in-person to hybrid connection in each of these sessions, and we've talked about moving from passive experiences to creative experiences. Each of these 4 cultural values is described in detail in my book, Grace in Gigabytes, and has formed the foundation of much of the work and research that I do, helping churches to align their traditions and their practices with a culture that's changed within the digital age. Now, when we talk about church leadership, especially hybrid church leadership, what we're concerned with is the development of a collaborative church culture. Collaborative church culture is in many ways a product of hybrid worship experiences that show community members who are connecting through a computer, that they're valued, that they're included, and that their contributions are celebrated. Just as it's a product of hybrid faith formation experiences that allow learners to explore different types of content at times that work for them, on locations that work for them, yet still bring learners to connect in face-to-face settings where they can construct and create their own knowledge. But when we talk about collaborative church culture in the context of leadership, we're talking about 3 items specifically. First of all, we're talking about coverage. How can we make sure that everything we're trying to lead through, all of the operations, all of the transformation, all of the work that we're doing as lay and ordained or rostered church leaders, is accessible through virtual and face-to-face means? How do we make sure every meeting has the option for a Zoom dial-in? How do we make sure that communications can happen asynchronously? How do we make sure we have the right channels, not just for communication, but also for deep work? This is also a question of quality. How do we make sure that our communications and our collaborative work is immersive enough that we can get past superficial text level communication and into deep dialogue? Finally, this is about connectivity. How many people can we pull into this conversation? In the digital age and with hybrid church leadership, leadership and the quality of our church experience is enriched with the more voices, the more diverse experiences we can pull into the conversation. So when we talk about hybrid church leadership, fundamentally, a lot of this begins with, well, what software are we going to use? And this is one of the few times that I will actually begin a conversation by thinking about the tools, by thinking about the tactics. You'll recall when I talked about worship, when I talked about faith formation, I encouraged you to start by thinking. I encourage you to start by thinking about mission and vision and goals, and to craft your technology use around those things. When it comes to leadership, though, we need to give technology and tools a little bit of a spot in the front of the line. That's because software is what enables the active collaboration in a hybrid space. We can't be collaborative in a hybrid culture if we don't have the tools and the resources to allow us to collaborate. So this afternoon, I'm going to tell you a few things about how to use software effectively, about how to get the most out of the software you're already using, and how to make sure that that software isn't just oriented towards communication, but is actually oriented towards collaboration. We'll have 2 breakout sessions this afternoon, which will happen at the end of our time. So breakout 1, we'll pause at about 3:35, 3:45 Central Time, take about 10 minutes, and then we'll have another breakout from there. And as always, feel free to post questions within the chat. Comments, feedback, pushback are all welcome. We'll also pause if anyone wants to share a question out loud. That is certainly welcome as well. But when it comes to collaboration, when it comes to hybrid leadership, fundamentally this begins with software. And rather than trying to recommend a specific app or a specific tool, I want to start by thinking about some of the factors that can help you to discern which tools are best and which tools are most needed in your ministry. So the first consideration that I think of when I think of hybrid leadership and when I think of collaborative software is who needs to be involved with publishing information. This is one of the biggest changes that's going to occur from the analog synchronous church that we were prior to the pandemic to the hybrid church that we will soon become. Because in the hybrid church that we'll soon become, a lot more people will need to publish and share information than what was perhaps previously experienced. Whereas communications and publishing and sharing information was once the domain of a few staff, perhaps some rostered and ordained leaders, we'll soon be in an environment where there are lots of different connection points, where different levels of the community will want to share information with one another. So when it comes to software, who needs to share information? Who needs to publish information? We'll come back to that point in just a minute. Subsequently, who needs to receive that information? All communication, really all collaboration, has both a sender and a receiver. When we select a digital tool, we want to make sure that the recipients of the information are able to, in fact, receive the information. Third, what tools do we already use? It's possible that your ministry is already well on the way to hybrid ministry and may not need to purchase or provision additional resources. You might already have everything you need. It's also possible that you might be able to obtain everything you need for free. So we don't always need to add on to the stack. In fact, sometimes that's not advantageous to do. But sometimes we do need access to different tools, and sometimes it's pretty apparent what tools we're going to need access to. A couple of other considerations that I want to emphasize here. How do we differentiate communication from collaboration? My wager would be if you're using some kind of a technology and you think it's collaborative technology, most likely the technology you're using is a communications tool and not a collaborations tool. We're going to talk about some of those differences coming up in just a few moments. Perhaps a lesser considered factor in this conversation is the idea of creating some space for engagement of the physical or geographic neighborhood in which one's church building is situated. With hybrid ministry, we're not just some church body that's out there floating through the ether of the internet, but we're grounded in the reality of a specific community. Church buildings aren't always the most inviting to the neighbors. My church in Madison has a gated parking lot, and the doors are typically locked for safety reasons on Monday through Friday. Some of those reasons are unlikely to change given the realities of insurance policies. But there's a way to perhaps mitigate some of those limitations by being clever with our use of technology. So what I have here is a grid or a visualization, a roadmap, if you will, of the different connection points that are involved in collaborative work and in communications in a hybrid church. Running across in the columns and across in the rows are four different audiences that all churches are likely to need to engage in the collaborative process. Every congregation is going to have a congregation. It's going to have some lay leaders who are perhaps board members, council members, foundation members. Most likely, your church has some rostered, ordained, or ordained leaders or clergy. And it's also pretty likely, like I said, that unless your church exists in virtual reality or something along those lines, that your church has a neighborhood in which you are situated. Each of these four connection points needs to be able to send and share information just as it receives and responds to information. The way we select tools then, the way we evaluate different software and different resources and different pieces of technology starts with this conversation of what is the best way for these points of intersection to communicate with one another. Now, there are some technologies on this grid that are already familiar, that the church has been using widely going back to March of last year. One of those technologies is an email list. For many years, rostered leaders, clergy, even lay leaders have been using email to send out email blasts to their congregation. Email is a great technology, and it's probably not going to go away. So we want to make sure that we're using it to the best of our ability. Similarly, it's also pretty likely that there's a connection point between church leadership and our congregation that exists within our Facebook page. A Facebook page is likely the way that most congregations are using Facebook at the moment. It's effective for sharing announcements, for creating invitations, and for publishing dates and times of upcoming events. Most likely, if your church is on Facebook, it has a Facebook page. The final the final piece of technology that your church is probably already using quite effectively is Zoom or some other video conferencing software. Zoom is a great way to connect with the neighborhood, particularly when it's when we're in these times of digital distribution. You'll notice here though that I have several cells that are highlighted, and this is where we have an opportunity to move the needle, to become more collaborative with our use of technology. Most of the connection points between the groups of people within our ministry don't actually have a way to connect with one another. And because they don't have a way to connect, they don't actually have a way to collaborate. Let me give you an example of that. Slack is a widely used tool that's used by organizations, nonprofits, businesses of all sizes. And it's also used as a way to connect with individuals outside of the organization. One of the great things about Slack is you can have a chat conversation with just about anyone who you've given access to your chat account. If Slack is a brand new technology to you, if you've never heard of Slack, I would describe it as a fun chat room that allows you to do meaningful and topically relevant work. A fun chat room that allows you to do meaningfully and topically relevant work. Going back to my story about how I started about that afternoon in Ann Arbor when I circled the block in search of a parking spot, only to give up and show up with just 10 minutes remaining in the meeting. All of that could have been solved by spinning up a free or low-cost Slack account. That committee, which had 5 individuals on it, launched our website through a series of tedious in-person meetings. We probably could have saved ourselves from doing any meetings at all had we just implemented Slack and had a way to talk to one another. Ruth, thank you for the shout out. Ruth shared that the Board of Cooperative Ministries uses Slack and would be glad to talk to folks about it. Ruth's email address is in the chat. Thanks, Ruth. Slack, though, isn't the only collaborative technology that I would recommend exploring. A couple of others that are top of mind are shared email addresses as well as Facebook groups. Let me tell you a little bit about shared email addresses. Most of us, when we think about email, we think about a single address that pertains to a single individual. I want to email Pastor Jones, so I email pastorjones@oursaviors.net. Off goes the email. Pastor Jones receives it. Hopefully, Pastor Jones can respond to it. There's this one-to-one character of email communication. A shared email address, though, gives multiple members of a committee, of a task force, or a staff the ability to respond to email and to send email from a shared inbox. So going back to my website example in Ann Arbor, what our group could have done if we wanted to use email would have been to create a shared email address through either a basic free technology like Google Groups, or perhaps a more advanced piece of technology such as Zendesk, which would allow us to send an email to web development at oursaviors.net, and all of us could work out of the same inbox. This is becoming a popular concept with teams that have to share work and pull multiple voices and multiple perspectives into the conversation. Finally, I want to talk briefly about Facebook groups. Facebook groups it's not a new feature on Facebook, but it's most likely an underutilized feature, especially among churches. A church basically has access to 2 levels of Facebook usage. One level is the Facebook page, which we've talked about, that has your address, your operating hours, your dates and times, basically the bulletin board information that people need to know about your congregation. The problem with Facebook pages is that there's very seldom an opportunity for multi-directional back and forth conversation. So if you want to promote collaborative work across your congregation and between the congregation and the neighborhood you serve, the specific technology I recommend is a Facebook group. Now groups are often closed or semi-private communities online, and they allow for that multi-directional communication, for back and forth question and answer, for discussion, dialogue, and debate. Nona Jones, who's an author that I've read, writes convincingly about the need for Facebook groups within congregations in her latest book, From Social Media to Social Ministry. If you haven't checked out that book, I would highly recommend it. It's an excellent how-to on implementing Facebook groups in your congregation. Now, when we think about all of these technologies, when we think about all of the technology that's available for a hybrid ministry, I think it's sometimes helpful to visualize these tools on the dimensions of what allows us to communicate versus what allows us to collaborate, and also what allows us to send text-based information versus what allows us to send multimedia information. As I've mentioned, a lot of the technology that we use in the church is actually not geared towards collaboration. It's geared towards communication. What's the difference? Well, with communication, I'm not necessarily inviting you in to participate in shared work or shared effort or shared mission. I simply want to inform you of what's coming up. Newsletters, church bulletins, and church websites are the quintessential examples of communicative text-based technologies. These are great resources for doing communications, but they're a very small piece of the picture of the hybrid collaborative church. Similarly, Technologies like YouTube and popular streaming services like Vimeo allow us to communicate in the sense that they allow us to broadcast, but they don't always allow for that multi-directional communication, that back and forth, the discussion and dialogue that's so crucial to the collaborative experience. Collaborative technologies are all around us, and many of them are free and many of them are low cost. In fact, we're joined together here on a collaborative technology, which is Zoom. But things like Google Docs, popular messaging apps like GroupMe and Remind, or resources like Slack, which I just mentioned, are all excellent ways to move from communication towards collaboration. Now, I'm not endorsing all of these technologies. I'm not saying you need to use all of these. The key here is to make sure that we're selecting technology and selecting resources in such a way that allows us to do the work of communications, which is necessary and important, and to add on an additional layer of collaboration, which is new and perhaps emerging for many of us. So going back to this piece about software and how do we know what software to use, a couple of other things, a couple of other thoughts that I want to leave you with. First of all, I want you to think about what are the specific opportunities that you want to collaborate on in your congregation. Some congregations will want to collaborate on sermon writing, some on worship planning, some on music, some on liturgy. Some will want to collaborate on planning blood drives and food drives and book drives. Some will just want to kick around ideas, discuss theology, discuss scripture. Different collaborative efforts require different approaches to tech. So here's where that missional awareness is so important. Be grounded in what you want to do. Use the specific technologies that you think match up there. Integrating with existing systems is critical. So many churches have found that when they implement the latest technology, the latest shining example of digital tech, they pay for it, they go through the effort, and it doesn't work. A great example is when organizations who are using Microsoft Office and the Microsoft 365 suite attempt to onboard Slack. Slack will work with organizations that use Microsoft products, but Microsoft Teams is actually a better plugin to what they're already doing. Similarly, if you're using Gmail and Google Docs for everything, adding Microsoft Teams probably isn't your best bet. There's a whole ecosystem of software out there, and it's not always clear what intersects with what integrates with what integrates where. If this is sounding complicated, what I would recommend to you is to look at the word that immediately precedes the name of the technology. Microsoft Teams, Google Docs. Google and Microsoft don't always like each other. Apple and Google really don't like each other. Chances are, if you have software from companies that don't like each other, they may not integrate as well as you'd like them to. Feasibility of use, given your congregation's technical requirements. You can't say enough about this one. If your congregation is in a particular community or neighborhood that has been underserved in its access to high-speed broadband internet, it may not be feasible to implement Zoom widely because not everyone is going to have access to the requisite bandwidth for Zoom. And well, I think it's an equity issue and an issue that church is called to address to make sure we all have a certain level of access to broadband internet. We want to make sure that the technology we're going to implement matches the speed of our internet and the technical skills found within our congregation. Quality of tech support. Make sure before you pay for anything that tech support is available, and it's available to you without having to jump through an arduous phone tree. If you have to spend 15 minutes explaining your issue or your question to an automated robot, you might want to look elsewhere for a technological solution. Give yourself the grace and the freedom to purchase those products that are well supported, where there's teams that'll help you to deploy these resources. This, by the way, is a tip I always give when talking about worship software. If the company you're relying on for streaming or broadcasting your worship service doesn't have support on Easter morning, probably not the best place for you to look for worship streaming software. Only after we think of these factors should we think of cost. What we find with digital tech, what we find with collaborative tech, is that these are resources that are often available to us on a subscription basis, and that subscription is paid monthly and is quite cheap relative to other aspects of our ministry. Churches spend 22% on average on building, on things like mortgage, things like upkeep, things like insurance. They tend to spend 25 to 50% of their budget on things like staff, on health insurance, on salaries. This will be a drop in the bucket relative to those large expense items. Collaborative technology is cheap. We just want to be selective about what we choose to adopt. I got a great question here in the chat. Thank you, Cindy, for asking this. How do we know what software will integrate for the best use? Well, I would again go back to the question of what do you want to use it for? Do you want to bring individuals together to work on a project? If so, do you want those individuals to connect synchronously at the same time? If so, I would recommend Zoom. Do you want those individuals to not have to take time out of their busy schedules and to work asynchronously? If so, I would go with Slack, with GroupMe, or with WhatsApp, all messaging apps. In terms of answering that question, Cindy, I think the first question I would start with is, what's our project? Second question, what's our preferred working style, synchronously or asynchronously? And I would choose the technology from there. Some of you are probably a little overwhelmed by all of this. There is an ocean of digital tools and tech out there, and it can be difficult to navigate. Even for someone whose career has been in the technology industry, you just can't keep up with all that's out there and all that's emerging. So I always talk to groups about maintaining a commitment to digital minimalism, because the reality is, if you think you can't keep up with the pace of digital change, you're absolutely right. And if you think you can keep up, you're probably maybe selling yourself a little bit short, or perhaps not being completely honest with yourself. So start by considering what your mission is, what your projects are, where you want to collaborate, and prioritize the technologies that really align with what you want to do. As I've said a few times, doing one thing really well with digital tech is vastly preferable to trying many things and to being always on at all times and on all channels. A great book, by the way, that details this is Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism. Cal is a computer scientist at Georgetown University who has written extensively about the need to be selective and choosy. And Cal is an advocate for using collaborative technology, for using software that makes us more collaborative, that helps us to do work in hybrid spaces that blend the online with the offline. But Cal is also critical of organizations that have too much technology in their stack, that are trying to do too many things in too many different places, and as a result make things more confusing for everyone. Check out Cal's book if you haven't yet. So from here, we're gonna move into our breakouts. I do want to see if there's any questions thus far, or any other questions I should cover before we jump over to our breakouts. Feel free to post those into the chat. All right, well, what I'm going to do is post our first two breakout questions for us this afternoon. They are, what collaborative tools are you currently using? in your congregation or in your ministry context? And what are some of the challenges? What are some of the things that get in the way of using those tools? In just a minute, you should see an invitation to a breakout appear on your screen. I do just want to mention though, Tracy, thank you for the question, posting the resources that you've mentioned in the chat. Yes, I will work to post some of those resources in the chat. They will also be available with the slides to this afternoon's presentation, which will be available to any conference registrant. All right, welcome back, everyone. I am going to post a couple of files in the Zoom chat here. One of which is that grid that I showed you with the different points of connection, the different communications channels that we want to think about in this conversation. I will work on that, but I want to just see, what did everyone think? Where's everyone at with this? If you want to jump off mute and share your perspectives or type into the chat, I'm curious what you're using, what tools are you using, and what are some of the challenges of using those tools?
Ryan, in our group, Rebecca Craver here, we talked about how some of the collaborative tools aren't shared among, like, everyone doesn't know how to use them. So like groups know how to use maybe Google Docs, but not everyone. And the kind of the challenge it puts with people that don't have access to that, like, you know, how does a church do that? And we're talking about what would it look like for a church to sort of decide as a congregation, like, this is the tool we're going to use, this is why we're going to use it, and then really put some effort into training people on how to use it, and to working with people who don't have access to see if we can get them access, and what would that look like, what would that cost. But that was sort of where we hung out, that it seems like it's all mixed up, and so everybody's doing different things. So where do you find a collaborative resource that works together?
Yeah, that is a great question, Rebecca, and it actually intersects with some of the things I'm seeing in the chat here. Like, what software to use for this, what software to use for that. There's this whole ecosystem of church-specific software vendors out there that will do church management, that will do church content, they'll do donations. One of the challenges of using church-specific software is it's not widely used by the congregation already. It requires a steeper learning curve to learn how to use something like, in my church, we use Breeze, than to use something like WhatsApp or Slack, which are a little bit more widely used, though maybe not as widely used in church circles as in tech circles. But you're absolutely right to name the enablement piece as a key challenge. That's why when you're looking at adopting technologies, it's always more useful to just do one, and to do one to train everyone on it, to explain this is where we've chosen to be church community. We've chosen to be church community on this Facebook group and using Zoom when we're not in the building together. Here's the expectations on how to engage in those channels. If you are a lay leader, here's the expectations for how to stay involved and connected and in the loop. So you're absolutely right to name the training need, the definitive training need that emerges from this conversation. There's been a few questions here in the Zoom chat about polls and about voting. So just to address those, Zoom polls are an excellent way to do any kind of voting. There are some limitations to Zoom polls. You can't always tell who voted for what option, and all of the results appear, they're anonymized and they appear all at once. So it's a little bit difficult to drill into those specifically. Usually in a church council setting, most of the votes that I've participated in, it's pretty clear what the outcome is prior to the actual ballots being cast. So in that type of situation, a Zoom poll is a very effective technology. Again, and that's a situation, council management or running a board meeting where using a tool or a system that's ubiquitous and widely used is going to pay more dividends than adopting something brand new or something church specific that doesn't have that momentum of outside usage behind it. And also Ruth pointed out the poll option does only allow one response per poll. Google Forms is an option, as Ruth pointed out, as is SurveyMonkey. All of those are widely used tools that allow you to have multiple responses and multiple different ways of taking a poll or a survey. Looking through a couple of the other questions here. What's the benefit of using Slack and other messaging apps over, say, just texting? Slack is a little bit more collaborative. It's easy to, work on a file. It's easy to start a Zoom call from Slack. You can integrate Google Docs within a Slack conversation, and it's all quite seamless. Texting is a great way to communicate. It's actually a little bit cumbersome to get into an in-depth conversation using just text-based SMS. So SMS or texting would be an excellent communications channel. If you're not using it, check it out, but has some limitations as a collaborative resource. Looking at the time, we may not have time for a second breakout, but I'll go ahead and post the questions here. And I just, I'll just pose the question to the group. One of the challenges we've talked about here, Rebecca mentioned this, and it's come up with others as well. The challenge of using collaborative tools with congregations who maybe aren't trained to use them, with congregations that aren't particularly tech savvy. What's been your experience, and how are you helping your congregations and your lay leaders to use these resources? Would love to hear from you. Feel free to put your ideas in the chat or take yourself off mute and share your ideas. Carol posted, anyone use a phone tree? If anyone uses a phone tree, feel free to respond to Carol. Phone trees are a great way to communicate as well, particularly with those who maybe don't have consistent internet access. All right, so Aaron's using a technology called Multiplier. Bernard cited slow adoption as a challenge with working with lay leaders. Bernard, do you want to say a little bit more in the chat about what that looks like for you? And if anyone else has thoughts on overcoming the challenge of adoption of technology with lay leaders, feel free to include those in the chat as well. Don mentions using an automated phone tree for church-wide messaging. Oh, that's great, Don. Oh, Rebecca mentions having a dedicated volunteer to help people get proficient with Zoom. And it's worked well because that individual had time to commit to the effort. Zoom is really powerful technology. Most people don't know how to use nearly half of it. Sometimes just sending out a Zoom tip or a Zoom usage tip of the week can be a really powerful way to help your church members communicate more effectively when on Zoom. Zoom is not going away as a church communications platform. So the more we can teach our members to use Zoom to the fullest, the more collaborative they're going to be with us.
Just like Zoom has a whole bunch of short teaching tools that you can just go on and get a list, and some of them are live even, and you can ask questions of the person. I found the one I went on, he went very fast, so you have to keep. But the ones that you can just go on and click on anytime you want are really informative and helpful. And Don, Don mentioned, Don, could you tell them what you do, how you do all of your things together?
We actually have linked our Facebook, our YouTube, and our website so that it's only posted one time, but anybody can go on any one of those three websites to pick up our streaming service. I don't know exactly how it's done. I let the experts in the back of the room take care of it, but it makes it easier on everybody. They go on whatever they're comfortable with, and they can find our service.
Thanks, Carol and Don, for sharing those perspectives. Aaron also mentioned that your local library might be a great resource for you. Librarians spend a lot of time helping patrons to use the computer, to learn to use the internet, to learn to use Zoom. Yeah, +1, Aaron. I am a big advocate of local libraries myself. They can be an invaluable resource in closing some of the equity and access gaps that exist with digital technology usage.
Yeah, I had no idea how much they would do that until I was listening to her explain to someone how to get online. And it's like you see an E with a circle around it. And like that level of conversation for Internet Explorer or a Fire, like just what's Google and Firefox, and like just amazing what they're doing.
So cool to hear.
This is Steve Thompson. From a communication standpoint, and we use from a multimedia combination of Zoom and YouTube, but we try to communicate to everyone the things that we have learned. For example, I never knew that YouTube automatically translates your service that we put on each week into closed captioning. So our members who have hearing are hearing impaired, they can turn on closed captioning for any of our services. I didn't know that, and we've been doing this since March.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Steve. That's a it's such an interesting thing because it shows how there's just a continuous learning process that's involved with all of these technologies. And you know, when you learn something new about a technology you've been using for a long time, it can both feel like a eureka moment, but it can also be like, oh, how did I not see this to begin with? In a collaborative church culture, there's a certain level of humility that comes with technology use and a willingness to share what's working and what we've discovered along the way. One of the challenges I've shared with church leaders is I would challenge you to document what you're figuring out, to write down what's working for you, and to share it with fellow Moravian leaders, with your church leadership circles, because we're all trying to figure this out at the same time, and there's so few documented best practices. So learn and share.
I do think, Ryan, that one-on-one mentoring is really important, especially in the local congregation setting. We have a group at our church of older women, mostly widows. We call them the single sisters. And, you know, I taught my 80-year-old mother how to use Zoom. We did lots of test meetings together, you know, and then she's been teaching her group how to use it. And, you know, whatever that looks like, right? I think that the one-on-one piece is important because everybody learns so differently. Our primary challenge, though, is, you know, we do a pretty good job with the broadcasting communication, right? The live stream, the website, the Facebook page. It's the two-way communication that is a challenge for us, both from an engaging in worship kind of communication, but also the sort of internal communications with the church. That's continues to be a challenge. And usually it's sort of the squeaky wheel who has a connection to whichever software they like kind of takes that, but people who don't care about it and don't get taught it get left out.
Thanks for sharing that perspective, Ruth. The idea of digital mentors, you know, that's something that you see at places like Google. The highest tech companies in the world are pairing up mentors to train other coworkers about better tech usage. There's a reason for that. It's because it's effective and it works. And I think it's a model that scales quite nicely to church settings. One last comment from the chat here. Peggy mentions having a smaller church of mostly older members and the bulletins being emailed earlier in the week. And also Peggy seeing more people attending than prior to COVID.
But you got to say this was on conference call. This is a conference call. And what's been interesting about that is that some of these younger, either the children or grandchildren of these people have been attending as well, because they sort of help them get connected on the telephone. But the singing is fun. Everybody ends about 3 or 4 measures and differently. but it's fun, and it's been so inspiring.
So great to hear, Peggy.
Mhm.
Well, I
I'd
just
just
want to
like
say,
to, can I
okay,
just say one thing?
of
Real
course.
quick, and when we stream, our worship service is live and streamed. We have a cantor, a person who is singing the hymns by herself or himself. And so that when you're singing along at home, you can all kind of be on the same note. And so that's very helpful.
Thanks for sharing, Carol. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us through these conversations. In just kind of to wrap up the conversation, the whole reason why this matters, the whole reason why hybrid ministry is something that's worth pursuing, is because it allows the church to extend the broadest possible invitation. I just finished reading this great book. It's called American Grace by Robert Putnam. Aaron, I got it from my local library. It is 600 pages long, so it's a little dense, but it's a really fascinating study into why churches are so effective at equipping communities and equipping individuals for lives of service, generosity, and reciprocity. You know, the finding that I was struck with as I read this book is churches continue to be a hub for equipping the saints for the life of faith. The reason we need to pursue hybrid ministry is because we need to invite as many people as possible to partake in that work. In a culture that increasingly lives online, it's no longer sustainable to issue that invitation to only come to a building for 1 hour of the week on a Sunday morning. Hybrid ministry is the pathway to extending that invitation, and it's how we'll continue to equip the saints for a new generation. I'm going to post my email address and contact info here if you have questions or follow-ups to this session. In closing, I've probably teed up a lot of change-related ideas, so be sure to attend Ben's session starting next week. He's going to talk about how to adopt this change within your context and guide your congregations through the process of transition. It's been fulfilling and fun to work with all of you. Blessings as you continue to navigate the church's new normal, and as we look forward to reopening our church buildings and officially entering the hybrid era of ministry.